Hello everyone, my name's Brian, but you can call me the Bugler, and today we're going to be talking about the Sunbreaker Titan's second skill tree, the Code of the Fireforged. This skill tree focuses on increasing your damage output, from your melee ability to the super modifier. Each skill is trying to increase how much damage you deal. The melee ability Hammer Strike is activated in the same way as Shoulder Charge, except this ability reduces the defense of the enemy you hit. Tempered Metal is a skill that makes your ability kills grant an increase to movement speed and reload speed for you and your nearby allies. It stacks up to 3 times and lasts for 15 seconds. The next two abilities, Explosive Pyre and Vulcan's Rage, go hand in hand. They're both super modifiers, so we'll be talking about them together when the time comes. Let's talk about the melee ability first. The melee ability is activated by sprinting a short distance before you press the right bumper. When you hit an enemy, you deal 8 ticks of damage, which lasts for about 5 seconds. This is the same amount of time that the debuff lasts, which increases your damage to the enemy. It's also worth noting that we only deal 8 ticks of damage, as opposed to the 9 ticks that the other skill tree grants. This isn't such a big deal, I just thought it was strange and I wanted to document it. But let's take a look at that damage now. Before the debuff, we deal 21 damage for normal hits, and 31 on precision hits. After, we deal 31 on body hits and 46 on critical hits. This amounts to a 50% increase in damage, rounded down. The melee ability alone should make this tree worth using, but unfortunately, the other 3 skills don't quite stack up. Let's take a look at Tempered Metal next. First, we'll see the difference in reload speed when you have Tempered Metal active and when you don't. When I split the screen, on the right you're going to see a Tempered Metal buff times 3, and on the left will be without the buff. With the buff, we reload this fusion rifle in about 2 seconds, and without the buff, it takes us 3 seconds. That's not bad. That's a 33% increase in reload speed. And if you pay attention, you'll also see that the rate in which you switch your weapons and ready them has increased as well. Where things get disappointing, however, is the increase in movement speed. We're going to split the screen the same way as before, and you'll see me run down the middle of the church. As with my testing of the Dawnblade during the beta, I don't measure any noticeable increase in movement speed. No matter how many times I tested it, I couldn't get any real tangible increase besides a few fractions of a second. And keep in mind, this testing was done with a Titan who had 0 mobility, which means that if there was any change, it was so minuscule I couldn't measure it. But you don't have to keep all the minuscule buffs to yourself. This ability also applies to nearby teammates. Here you'll see what the buff looks like on your teammates when you get it to trigger. A light will appear above their head, and that light remains consistent whether or not it's a buff times 1 or times 3. As you'll see in this clip, my teammate gets all 3 buffs at the end and gives me a nice thumbs up. Let's push it to the limit. In this clip, you'll see exactly how far away you can be before you are unable to get the buff. In this clip, my teammate is about 10 meters away and he's unable to get the buff. So if you want your teammates to receive this unsubstantial buff, you want to keep them close. How many times can I say buff in a sentence? Tune in next time to find out. The next 2 skills, Explosive Pyre and Vulcan's Rage, are both super modifiers. Explosive Pyre makes it so your hammer kills make enemies explode, and Vulcan's Rage makes it so your hammers split on impact. I want to touch on something else first. In my previous video, I mentioned briefly that the max amount of hammers that you can throw in a super is 6. But if you watch this clip, you can clearly see that I can only throw 5, even though I'm throwing a hammer as soon as it becomes available. But how can this be? Well, let me explain. For some reason, the speed at which you can throw hammers is tied to how far you actually throw them, meaning that if you throw the hammers at your feet or close enough to you, you'll actually be able to throw 6, as you see now. This doesn't apply to the other skill tree either, whose max amount of hammers is 10, and that's because the speed at which you can throw the hammers increases only so slightly, meaning that you can only take advantage of it because you're throwing less hammers. Let's take a look at Explosive Pyre and Vulcan's Rage now. Vulcan's Rage actually splits your hammer into 6 projectiles, even though it appears to be 3. They're released in clusters of 2 in 3 separate directions, but they are grouped so closely together that you couldn't see that they were separate unless you threw them at a wall. That doesn't mean much, however, considering in almost all cases they'll be sent out in the same direction. Explosive Pyre, on the other hand, I found to be near impossible to test, and that's because when the hammer splits due to Vulcan Rage, it will kill almost any enemy near the explosion, and any enemy that would be caught in the Explosive Pyre explosion. meaning that every enemy that I hit with an explosive Pyre explosion was so far away that the damage they received was minuscule, meaning that there was damage fall off. So I couldn't get any conclusive numbers for how much damage Explosive Pyre would actually deal on its own. For all intents and purposes, I found this skill to be near useless. If it had applied to every solar ability that you had access to, however, I could see the utility. Unfortunately, it just seems to be too niche and deal too random of an amount of damage to actually make a difference in gameplay. It's definitely the low point of this skill tree. Vulcan's Rage, however, is actually pretty interesting and can deal a pretty high amount of damage to single targets, as you'll see now. I'm going to slow this clip down, but you'll see that I deal consistently 116 damage for direct hammer hit. If 2 of the 6 projectiles branch off and explode at the same time, they deal 113 damage, which is almost 100% of the initial hammer damage. This is great. In the best possible scenario, if you hit an enemy, this enemy specifically, with 6 hammers, and each piece hits that enemy, you will deal 2,700 damage. This may not seem like a lot of damage initially, but if you take into account the enemy that I'm using it on, who has a high damage resistance and a high elemental damage resistance, you'll realize how high this damage actually is. Unfortunately, this isn't a best case scenario, which might as well be fantasy. In my next video, which will be a Sunbreaker guide that also covers the grenade abilities, I'll be testing the maximum theoretical damage of both skill trees and see which one is actually higher. I wanted to include it in today's video, but due to the maintenance that Bungie had scheduled, I was unable to do the testing. And that wraps up our video. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it, and I hope you find it useful. If you did, let me know in the comments. If you didn't, or you think there's some way I can improve my video, also let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. You can expect my Sunbreaker guide on Thursday this week. So once again, thanks for watching, I hope I see you next time, and good luck getting through the exclusion zone.